So, Generation 8 coming to a close upon the release of Generation 9, I thought it would be interesting to do a retrospective of the Generation 8 competitive meta in Monotype. It certainly was an interesting one. Overall, I really enjoyed it. It's what kind of got me into doing my channel, and I think overall it definitely was a good one. However, it was not without its controversy. The meta itself didn't come out for a few weeks after the launch, and it was a mess to say the least. I don't know where to begin with this one. We all know about Dexit and the controversies it brought alongside it. Some, however, thought maybe this would be a chance for some underutilized mons to shine. Unfortunately, that wasn't particularly the case, because alongside it came a lot of power creep. Newly added Pokemon like Corviknight and Dracofish ended up being extremely strong forces in the meta, and ended up bringing massive boons for their types. Unfortunately, this led to some types being much stronger than others, and others being left utterly devastated. So let's put this into perspective of how bad things were actually at launch Gen 8 Monotype. There was discussion of Pasho, Berry, Stonejourner against physical water threats on Rock just to have some semblance of bulk. For example, trying to withstand a Vicious Rend from Dracovish, Pasho, Berry, Stonejourner was actually a thing people threw around as a potential counter, so yeah, it was pretty bad. I can barely say that one with a straight face. However, the biggest new addition to the generation in terms of power creep was definitely the new gimmick Dynamax. Thankfully for many, it didn't last long, however. Not even a week into the meta, and both Smooth Rock and Damp Rock got banned. With it being even easier to set up weather than ever before thanks to Dynamax moves, these items are seen as far too strong for both water and ground especially, allowing them to have insane sweeping potential. My thoughts on this ban are a little mixed, but that's a conversation for another day. Much like any other monotype generation, they were seen as too strong and ultimately banned. Was this enough to stop types like water and ground being monstrous forces in the meta? Well, it certainly didn't work for water, that's for sure, as this type would persist to be a massive threat in the meta for some time to come yet. Just a little more than a month after release, Christmas had come early for monotype players. Dynamax was finally banned from the tier. The council had decided that it was simply too strong for the tier to handle, and I am in complete agreement. The only thing I'm surprised about is it actually lasted this long in the tier to implement this ban, as it was a rough time for the meta. Any type that synergized well with its max move, such as max flying giving a speed boost to Moxie Sweepers, like Gyarados or Salamence, or max water move, for example, giving Swift Swimmers a powerful boost to speed and rain. Any type that synergized well with its max moves, such as max flying, giving a speed boost to Moxie Sweepers, like Gyarados and Salamence, or even max water giving Swift Swimmers a powerful access to rain, giving them speed and power boost, became extremely potent. Hawlucha, with a mix of increasing attack and speed with its stabs, became another popular threat. This wouldn't be the first time in the meta that water and flying saw top tier domination, but flying's reign would not last. For now. I really can't state how important I think this ban was for the monotype meta. I really don't see the meta having much of a future if it remained. Sure, some types didn't appreciate the ban, but I think overall the types that benefited from it outweighed them massively. The release of Pokemon Home was one of the biggest changes for the meta to date. A good amount of returning Pokemon and a litany of old moves and abilities returned to already existing Pokemon. Some of the biggest impacts to the meta were the Sword of Justice returning. Now finally fighting has some strong options. Ice having access to Kyurem and Alolan Ninetales for Veil setting, and Electric having access to both Alolan Raichu and finally a semi-decent physical attacker in Zeraora. These are three types that until now really did not have much love in this generation. So Electric and Ice suddenly got good. Does that mean Water and Flying were finally going to crumble? Well, in Water's case, not so much. It still has access to incredibly powerful tools, such as Vicious Rend, Swift Swimmers, and Toxapex, so it's hard to take this type down. However, Flying really struggled to survive in this harsh new meta of Ice dominance, even despite the fact fighting got stronger. Listed on the screen are not the only Pokemon to have returned in Pokemon Home, but legendaries such as Solgaleo, Lunala, and Kyurem White were immediately quick banned, without a second thought. So I've been fairly quiet about Steel up to this point, and it goes without saying if you're a fan of the monotype format, you know Steel is usually a dominant force in the meta. This was no different for early Generation 8. And this is in no small part due to the addition of Melmetal. Its titanic HP, attack and defense, paired with its honestly insane signature move Double Iron Bash, made this thing a force to be reckoned with. The type did struggle a little bit to this point because it didn't have Heatran back, so it didn't have the perfect balance it strived for, mostly losing to Fire Spam. However, it had plenty to cover its other weaknesses of ground and fighting. Some people cited Melmetal's low special defense and speed as reasons that it shouldn't be banned. However, ultimately it was thought that the Steel's sheer level of team support and the fact that if you were weak to Steel, there was essentially nothing you could do to withstand a banded double Iron Bash, as a double-hitting nature would break through sashes and even sturdy. Though debated on both sides, ultimately this led to Melmetal being banned 2 weeks later on March 30th. Don't worry though, Steel would still be a very potent threat in the meta for days to come. The Kyurem Black suspect test is quite an interesting one. It's honestly one I could probably do a full video on. I mentioned earlier this thing is an absolute monstrous powerhouse on both its types, Ice and Dragon. But why is that? In previous generations this thing was undeniably strong, but suffered from a bit of a shallow move pool. Well, for years both Ice and Dragon players asked for Kyurem to finally get a decent physical Ice move. Their wish was granted. While some would rather have seen this thing get something like Icicle's Crash, instead it got Icicle Spear. Some said this move was not reliable enough and could let you down when you needed multiple hits. While this is technically true, the same logic could also be applied to Icicle Crash's 90% accuracy. Well, okay, so Kyurem Black got a physical ice move. It's pretty good, but is it really ban-worthy? Well, that's not the only thing it got. It also got Dragon Dance. So now this thing can boost its nearly unparalleled 170 base attack even higher, while also patching up its mediocre speed. Thanks to the addition of heavy duty boots, it also no longer had to worry about entry hazards such as stealth rocks or sticky webs. It also had reliable recovery and roost, as well as the much coveted bolt beam coverage, meaning very few Pokemon could actually take a neutral hit from this. Types like Flying were absolutely left in the dust at the sheer power of this thing, with them having very little reliable ways to fight it. Sashes were of no use as Icicle Spear broke them. They could also not rely on any electric immunity such as a ground flying type, as that would only make them weaker to Icicle Spear. And any ice neutrality mons such as Corviknight went easily down to a +1 fusion bolt. On top of this, Kyurem's ability was essentially Mold Breaker, meaning it didn't even care about abilities such as Volt Absorb, Sturdy, and Thick Fat. There was essentially no reliable counterplay to this thing on many types. This isn't to mention its amazing team support it had on ice. It could easily hide behind an Aurora Veil, effectively halving all damage it takes, making it very difficult to break without an extremely strong super effective move. This allowed it ample time to set up its Dragon Dances and potentially sweep an entire team. Dragon also already had plenty of strong mons on its side to dispatch would-be threats to Kyurem. Ultimately, on May 24th, the suspect test finished, and Kyurem was banned from the format. This was met by a surprising amount of controversy, as the first wave of DLC was soon to come and shake the meta entirely. Some believe that Kyurem suspect should have waited until the Isle of Armor to see if this thing fared in the new meta. However, the suspect was based on how good Kyurem was in the current meta, which it was deemed far too strong for. What did this mean for Ice and Dragon? Well, it hurt a bit losing such a powerful Uber tier Pokemon, but it wasn't the worst ban in the history of Monotype, as regular Kyurem mostly took its place. While it served a different purpose, its typing was the same, and still saw great usage on both types while giving other types the hope it needed to take it down. The first of the big DLC patches finally released, and it brought back a huge list of returning Pokemon, including some new ones. Instead of going over every type and mon that was added, which I have done before in previous videos, I want to discuss what I think were the three biggest winners from this DLC, being Normal, Psychic, and Bug. Now these types didn't necessarily become meta-defining by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think their new tools put them somewhere on the map. With the return of the Slow Twins, including the new Galarian Slowbro, and later Slowking, and Alakazam, Psychic suddenly had strong pivoting options yet again. On top of its new move Expanding Force, it had insanely powerful wall-breaking potential with the new Gen 8 Pokemon in DD. Things were looking pretty good for Psychic, but that wasn't to last so long. Unfortunately for Psychic, alongside its success came the highly threatening bug types, such as Heracross, Caesar, and most notably Volcarona. All of these returning threats made Bug very prevalent in the meta. This paired with the Generation 8 edition of heavy duty boots made Bug a force to be reckoned with. On top of this, Flying was not prevalent enough in the meta to stop it, as well as Water being very powerful means Fire didn't see a huge amount of meta usage either. This was a very good time for Bug to shine. I mentioned as well normal got a lot of great tools added back, and it got none other than its entire defensive core, Porygon 2 and Chansey/Blissey. With heavy duty boots, Blissey was arguably even better than before, and alongside it, some powerhouses such as Porygon Z and Exploud were added back as well. While I think normal remained fairly underwhelming in most of Gen 8, these are definitely welcome tools to return. There's a pair of new forms also added to the DLC that would later go on to become fairly meta-defining threats, Urshifu. I won't go into too much detail about the bear because it will show up again in the not too distant future. Also, in case you were curious, yes, water was still a top tier threat. But wait, you might be asking, Steel and Fairy got Magearna, surely that made them as dominant threats in the meta? Well, if that's what you're thinking, you're absolutely correct. Magearna is back and arguably better than ever, thanks to it now getting Draining Kiss for longevity and stored power for absolutely absurd damage output. This monster lasted 4 very long days in the Monotype meta, where it became such a suffocating force for so many types that it had no other option to be quick banned. Despite fighting getting new tools such as Urshifu, it was practically an auto-lose to Magearna. Even would-be top-tier threats such as Water, if played poorly, would see itself come to ruin against Magearna. What of its weaknesses though? Fire and Ground are all too common offensive types, sure, but both Steel and Fairy had great balanced cores to ensure that Magearna wouldn't have to be eating too many super effective hits. All this paired with its ability Soul Heart, meaning if Magearna could just live long enough to see a single Pokemon faint, it is potentially game over for your opponent. The Monotype Council ended up deciding to quick ban this, with a vote of 7 to 9 in favour of the ban. Good riddance. I mentioned earlier discussing the bear in more detail. Well, here we go. The new poster child for the DLC was Urshifu, who came in 2 forms, Rapid Strike and Single Strike, both of which had amazing tools to their name. The pair had a very good base stats, new signature attacks that allowed them to always critical, and an ability Unseen Fist, which allowed their physical moves to bypass Protect, and Protect-like moves such as King's Shield. This would effectively allow them to ignore any scouting attempts. They also had useful pivoting options in U-turn, and powerful stab in close combat. Viably running Scarf or Band made this thing truly hard to predict, and even sometimes ran a bulky Drain Punch set. Surely with a laundry list of powerful tools and attributes such as this, they'd be seen as too powerful for a somewhat limited meta. While Single Strike's sidekick survived in the tier, for now, its Surging sibling could not brag the same. Not only did Rapid Strike Surge hit 3 times, allowing it to even bypass things such as Substitute or Sturdy, it was also a water type, meaning it was boosted even further by the already prevalent rain. Water was already considered a meta-defining type at this point in the game, so adding such a powerful tool was considered too powerful for the tier to handle. So what would this mean for Water overall? Well, not really that much. Water got over it quickly and replaced it with other powerful Pokemon, and still remained a dominant threat, and Fighting switched to Single Strike, for which I would argue is preferred in the type anyway, due to its Dark typing being able to hit Ghost and Psychic types. However, it did allow every other type to have a quick sigh of relief, as one other threat was banned from the tier. The Crown Tundra finally released, alongside it many new tools and Pokemon that it's hard to even begin. I don't want this to be a complete analysis of the DLCs, as I've done that in previous videos, so you can check them out if you really want to on my channel. But let's look at the types that had a big impact, and thanks to the returning mons. The return of Nido's, Crobat, and Nihilego made an already very strong type even stronger. Poison finally now had wall-breaking potential in Nidoking, as well as reliable ground immunity and disruption in Crobat. Finally, Nihilego gave Poison speed control it so craved, with his newly added Meteor Beam also made a potential lethal late-game sweeper. On top of all of this, it had great specially defensive friend for Toxapex, Slowking Galar, thus solidifying one of the best defensive regen cores in the game. Getting all its Tapus back gave it the versatility it needed to stand out once again in the meta, as it found quite a good home for itself yet again, even despite the fact a Steel saw dominant play. There was, however, one top-tier dominating type looming in the shadows, and it was up to 2 types to try and put it back in its place. Rock was thrown a bone with all its fossils returning, alongside the Ultra Beasts, Nihilego and Stakataka. It wasn't going to become a top-tier threat by any stretch of the imagination, but it did see at least semi-viable in the current power-boosted meta, and not fall completely into obscurity. Water and Steel being top-tier threats made it hard for Rock to truly be anything outside of a niche counterpick for the aforementioned new top tier. But what of Electric? Electric would have been a much better chance to be the counterpick this team needed. with the new Regieleki boasting a ludicrous 200 base speed, rising voltage hitting obscene levels of power, part of its new ability Transistor. This, as well as Tapu Koko coming back to grant the electric terrain it craved, as well as another great defensive option in Zapdos. Electric seemed on the fast track to become the next meta-defining type. It would be able to stave off Water, Steel, and its new top tier. Well, it certainly became a formidable threat in the meta. It made top tier types such as Water and Steel change its team builds just to prepare itself for Electric. It would even go as far as to nearly invalidate some low tier types such as Fighting and Bug, but it would not become the undisputed ruler of Monotype that some thought it might become. If you haven't already identified what sat at the apex of the tier, it was none other than Flying. This type went from hero to zero, back to hero, all over again in the space of this generation. This can be attributed to the return of the Kanto birds, genies, both Incarnate and Therian, Celesteela, and the new addition of the Galarian legendary birds. There was just so many powerful tools that Flying had both offensively and defensively. It is one of the few types that can perfectly cover all its weaknesses, which is extremely potent playstyle in any monotype team. On top of this, has some incredibly powerful offensive tools for breaking even the bulkiest of teams. But it doesn't stop there. Heavy-duty boots worked wonders for this type, ignoring one of the most glaring flaws in previous gens, Stealth Rocks. All in all, Flying became one of the most dominant types at almost all levels of Gen 8 monotype play. Whether this type is the rightful heir to the crown of the monotype tier, or a usurper, is up for debate, but what isn't is how this type became to define Generation 8 monotypes. The meta, however, was not completely settled. Some more bans had to come. I'm not going to go over each item in detail, but some weeks following the release of Crown Tundra, several quick bans, including Blaziken, Formosa, Magearna, Naganadel, Terrain Extender, Kartana, Damp Rock, Smooth Rock, and Kyurem Black were seen as too good for the meta and thus banned. For the most part, these didn't have enough time in the meta to truly define any one single type, and for the most part I do think they were very healthy bans. Fighting certainly didn't like two of its best new tools being banned, and would fall into relative obscurity yet again for another era of this generation. The removal of hidden power was certainly a controversial one for this generation, and it led to the increased power of some vital threats, one of the big ones being Landorus Incarnate. This thing would serve to be an almost unrivaled wall breaker on both ground and flying, two teams that certainly weren't lacking in that department. Ground would certainly miss its gravity, essentially allowing the type to spam its stab for a few turns. It would overall just turn to Nidoking for similar wall breaking potential, and Flying generally didn't mind running Therian. Overall, this ban would not serve to significantly weaken these two types, but overall was healthy for the meta, allowing weaker types who couldn't handle the pressure that Landorus Incarnate brought. Sometime after Rapid Strike, Urshifu Single Stripe was up for suspect. Players promptly decided that they wanted it banned from the tier. Its potential was very similar to that of Rapid Strike, focusing a little more on immediate power of the trade-off of a multi-hitting move. Its typing was quite strong, being able to break through almost every non-fairy in the tier. For some types, it wasn't viable or even possible to guarantee you have a fairy in your team just to counter this thing. Even then, it was possible for it to run Iron Head in the case you did. Its ban would cause a lot more suffering for fighting, as this type saw a lot of heavy hits early in the generation from bans. Dark would of course also miss such a powerful tool, but in the long run it would regain its feet in the meta. I can't confirm, but I feel like this ban would ultimately be what led this rise of Ghost later in the meta as well. It was hard for me to believe it took this long, but when researching the video I found out, from the responses to the Monotype tier held in April of this year, there was a huge amount of backlash and anti-Dracovish feelings. This ultimately led to the council quick banning it. Based on how I talked about it earlier, it's a genuine wonder how this thing lasted so long in the tier, because it's unforgivably powerful. On Rain, this thing had virtually no switch-ins in the tier outside of immunities that would let every type had the pleasure of running. It could run Choice Scarf to patch up its mediocre speed, or ban to allow it to one-hit KO things it normally only two-hit KO. This ban was absolutely necessary, and it was deemed by some to be potentially one of the most uncompetitive Pokemon Monotype has ever seen. So what would this mean for Water? Would this be the thing to stop making it a potentially lethal Monotype threat? No, not exactly. Water had plenty more tools to choose from. Granted, it didn't like losing an instant win button against a lot of teams, but it certainly managed. Dragon certainly didn't appreciate the ban too much either, but outside of Rain this thing was a little more manageable, and the type had plenty of viable Pokemon to choose from, so it wasn't an absolute devastating loss. However, it was a massive victory for the entire rest of the tier. Steel was rightfully identified as one of the most powerful dominant forces in the Monotype meta. As such, it was time to look at what made it so. For the most part, it was Steel's almost unbreakable defensive core, and what could be done to prevent this. As such, the council took a look at banning Aegislash. This ban would not reach the requirement from the players to be banned, with a majority voting for it not to be banned. I would certainly be the person to say Aegislash was certainly overpowered, if not downright broken in previous gens, and possibly even early Generation 8, but I think the meta had evolved to the point where Aegislash was more manageable for many teams. I think this ban not going ahead was a good thing, as it would have hurt Ghost a lot more than its Steel, which did not exactly rely on it completely. In my opinion, there should have been other suspects on the list to hurt Steel, to make this type a lot more manageable. Overall, Aegislash was not banned. Another round of quick bans came, and the council decided to quick ban some handful of items that were deemed uncompetitive. These items were King's Rock, Bright Powder, Lax Incense, Quick Claw, and Focus Band. While most high-level competitive teams wouldn't rely on unreliable items such as these, there was some cheesy tactics such as King's Rock Shell Smash Cloister or Quick Claw Galarian Slowbro. I think overall it wasn't a meta-shaking move to quick ban these items, but it did make the tier a little healthier, which I am all in favour of. While I don't have the exact time frame of when NatDex Monos was released, it was sometime around the time frame of 2021. I won't go into too much detail about this, as it would have the entire video to itself, but this unofficial tier decided to breathe life into Generation 8, which had come to become a little stale to some. It was essentially Generation 7-2. Megastones and Z-Crystals made a return, alongside Generation 8 Pokémon, and all I want to highlight was the biggest winners from this transition. Bug, Fire, and Normal went from the odd obscure meta usage to being very strong and prevalent types in the NatDex Mono format. We love that for them. Other than that, it was pretty much just a more powerful Generation 8 Monos, so we saw a lot of the usual suspects become quite powerful here too. The meta didn't reach the same levels of popularity as Generation 8, however, in its lifetime, but it eventually did see a decent active ladder and some big time fans. So, that is it for the history of Generation 8 competitive monotypes. Oh, wait. It wasn't? No, I've just been informed that nearly a year after the previous bans, on March 28th, 2022, Acupressure was banned from the tier. I'm not quite sure what spurred this all of a sudden, but there you go. That's actually the history of Generation 8 competitive monotype. Overall, it was a great journey, with some types being prevalent the entire generation, such as Steel or Water, with other types seeing its time to shine, such as Ice and Bug, and of course we had this hero to zero, back to hero story of Flying. It was probably one of the most ever-changing and evolving monotype formats due to the huge amount of changes and additions to the tier from DLC and expansions. A very exciting time to have monotype channel, I must say. I hope Generation 9 brings along similar exciting journey, and if you'd like to join this journey with me, definitely consider subscribing to the channel, as I have a lot of Generation 9 content planned. Of course, I couldn't have made this video if it wasn't for my friend Sergeant Milkshake, who helped me a massive amount in the research of this video, so huge thank you to them. And of course, huge thank you to you for watching this far. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you next time in Generation 9.